Welcome everyone. In this video, we are going over SHA-512 algorithm. We will see a quick overview of SHA-512 and SHA function family in general. We're going to see who oversees these algorithm and implementation and keeps them up to date. We are going to see the requirements we need for SHA-512 algorithm, and these concepts together form the first part of this series. And in the second part, we're going to talk about the algorithm itself and a worked example, and we're going to go back and forth between the algorithm and the example. So if you're already familiar with SHA functions and you know the necessary requirement you need to know to understand the algorithm, you are more than welcome to skip and move to the second part of the video to see the algorithm and the worked example. But if you are new to SHA functions and cryptographic hash functions in general, this is a good start. This is a good starting point for you. And I am assuming no prior information about SHA functions. So I hope you can get the most out of this video. If you like the content, I would appreciate if you can subscribe, like, and share. But other than that, let's get started. So what are SHA functions? Well, SHA stands for Secure Hash Algorithm. SHA functions are a family of cryptographic hash functions. So what do we mean by that? We mean we would like to have a mathematical function that, given an input, it gives us hopefully a completely random output that cannot tell us anything about the input. If the output is completely random, as it is the hope for the hash function, then we cannot reverse and get back the input that we started with. And if that's not the case, we can assume that the function that is being used is broken. SHA functions and cryptographic hash functions in general, they have very important applications in practice. And one of the most important application is password protection. So when you are signing up for a website, for example, you enter a password. Hopefully, the correct way of storing your password is to compute its hash value and store that instead of the plain password. SHA functions are published as part of FIPS, Federal Information Processing Standard, which states the publicly announced standard for use in computers by NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And these are all American institutions. The use of this, for the most part, for general public is voluntarily. It's not mandatory, but these are very good guideline to follow for sure. And everything that we're gonna see in these videos are public information. They are publicly available. All the links will be included. If you wanna take your time and read them at your own pace, you're more than welcome to do that. And it is also a good thing that this information is public, because if there are any vulnerabilities, we can share that information, and that shows our trust and confidence in the algorithm, that even though it is public, we trust that it works, and hopefully it is not broken. Now that we've seen a quick overview of SHA functions, we can see where we are at right now in terms of the development of SHA functions, and we'll see a quick timeline of how they've developed over time. In 1990s, the first series of SHA functions were published. We had SHA-0 and SHA-1 that came out in 1993 and 1995 respectively. Both of these algorithms, keep in mind, they should not be used in practice anymore. They might still have their educational and historical importance, but in practice they shouldn't be used because they're considered broken. And then in the early 2000s, we had the SHA-2 family. We had SHA-256, 384, and 512 came out in 2001. And interestingly enough, 3 years later, we had SHA-224 that was published. It might be question for people that why it came out in 2004, 3 years later than the other three variants. There is an interesting reason behind it that will take us further away from the main purpose of this video, but you can look that up on your own. And in 2012, two other variants came out for SHA-2. And then lastly, in 2015, that's the most recent development, the SHA-3 family was published. And you can see in the table that some of the names are overlapping. So we have SHA-512 both for SHA as part of SHA-2 family and SHA-3 family. So if someone is talking about SHA-512, they are probably referring to SHA-2 family. If someone wants to talk about the SHA-512 as part of the SHA-3 family, then they have to emphasize that it's part of the SHA-3. But when we're just talking about SHA-512 in general, we are referring to SHA-2 family. And that's the main purpose of this video. Now that we've seen the overview and some background of the SHA functions, I will talk about the requirements you need to understand these algorithm. And as mentioned in the beginning of the video, these are meant for people that have a minimal background in these functions and algorithms. So if you're already familiar with the things you need to know, then you're more than welcome to skip to the second video. To better understand SHA-512 algorithm, we need to understand the bitwise XOR operator, bitwise AND, and bitwise complement operators. Next, understanding right shift and right rotations is important as well. And lastly, there are a few other concepts such as conversions between hexadecimals, decimals, and binaries. This part is only for us humans to understand it, but for the purpose of implementing it in a computer, computers work in binaries and they can convert numbers very easily. So I'll just go over them only for the viewers to understand what is going on in the algorithm, and then understanding the conversions of fractions in binary and numbers in base 10 is going to be important. We're going to see the first 80 primes being used in this algorithm. If this is your first time encountering the SHA functions, it could sound very random, but we will explain and we will go over that and see why it's being used. And then we also need to be familiar with modular arithmetic. We will see that a lot of additions in the algorithm are done over mod 2 to the 64. And then lastly, we need to be familiar with the big endian convention, which states that the most significant bit stored in the leftmost bit position. The opposite of big endian convention is a little endian convention, where the most significant bit stored is in the rightmost bit position. Don't worry about all of these things. We're gonna go over them. So we will talk about these bolded items here, and we're gonna see all of these concepts as we're gonna go through the algorithm in the second video. So without further ado, let's get started with these operators that we need to be familiar with. So bitwise XOR operator, what is this? It is a binary logical operator, so meaning it takes two input and output a value. It can be viewed as addition modulo 2. And I like to give a real life example when I'm thinking about these logical operators, so it becomes more tangible, something that I can relate. So I guess one way to view this operator is you can think of a road that at any given time only one car can come from each direction, and we will assign a truth value whether we can have a car on the road or not. Or in general in life, you can have two choices. You can take one of the two choices, but not both of the choices at a time. So if we don't have any cars coming from both directions, in general, we don't have any car on the road. That's why we represent it with a 0. And then if we have one car coming from the left and no car coming from the right, then we can have that car coming to the road. That's not a problem. And then same thing the other way around. If a car is coming from the right hand side but no car is coming from the left hand side, we can have that car on the road. That's not a problem. However, if we have two cars approaching, one from left and the other from the right, we cannot allow both cars on the road. So that's why we cannot have any car on the road. Otherwise, it will lead to an accident. So that's why we assign a 0 to its truth table. And we will see an example in action. So here we have two strings, x and y. The only times that we will get a 1 overall is when one of the bits is 0 and the other is 1. Otherwise, we will assign 0 overall. And that's the resulting output that we get from XORing x and y in this example. And then next we have the bitwise AND operator. Again, this is another binary logical operator. And the example we can consider a scenario where a basketball team looks for potential players for their team. They require a minimum height of 190 centimeter and a maximum age of 25. So for example, someone who is 10 years old and 160 centimeter does not qualify, while the age is satisfied, the height is not, so that's why they can't. Someone who's 30 years old right away cannot be qualified because the age requirement is not satisfied, even though the height of 200 centimeter is satisfied, but the age is not. And someone who is 40 years old and 170 centimeter does not qualify because both of the conditions are not met. However, someone who is 22 years old and 200 centimeter overall qualifies, so because both the age and the height is satisfied. And we can see the truth table in this case. So if both conditions are not satisfied, overall it's not satisfied. If one of the conditions is satisfied, the other is not, again, overall the condition is not fully satisfied, so we assign 0. Same for the other way around. And the only case where we assign 1 for the truth value of this bitwise AND operator is the time when both of the conditions are satisfied or both of the bits are 1. So let's see another example in action. So consider our x and y with the bits that we see in the table. If we apply the AND operator in this case, the only bit that will get a 1 at the end is when both x and y are 1 in that place. So that will be the bit in the middle, and the rest of the bits will be 0, as we can see here. Next, we need to be familiar with the bitwise complement operator. This one is actually a unary logical operator. You can think of the word uno, which means 1. So it takes as an input only one object and output only one object as well. You can think of it as flipping 0 and 1s and vice versa. So every time you see a 0, just change it with a 1, and every time you see a 1, just change it with a 0. The real life example we can relate to is flipping the switch when we are turning on and off a light. And here we have the truth table. So if we see a 0, its bitwise complement is 1, and when we see a 1, its bitwise complement is actually 0. And again, we can see another example. Every time we see a 0, just flip it with a 1, and every time we see a 1, we will flip it with a 0, and that's the resulting string. Next, we need to be familiar with the right shift operation and the right rotation. These are kind of hand-wavy definitions, so it helps us better understand the algorithm later on. So if you would like to know about these operations, please look them up and read them more in details. But in general, right shift, we can simply think of it as replacing any fallen bit with a 0 to the left. So we will see an example in a second. So consider the following string. We have 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. And now we will see what it happens if we are shifting this 3 bits to the right. So in the first scenario, we have the starting string that we have. Now, if we are shifting it 1 to the right, well, we have 1 at the most right spot. That 1 will fall, and we're going to replace it with a 0. The reason that we are seeing this definition in this sense is because in the algorithm itself, in the SHA-512 algorithm, these operations are done over words of certain length. So it could be a word of length 64, and no matter what the rightmost input is at the end, the output must be another word with the same length. So just keep that in mind. And then again, if we want to shift this string to the right by 2 bits, now we have 0 on the right. Again, we're gonna make it fall off the cliff if you want to think of it that way, and then we replace it with another 0 to the left. And then the same idea again, we have 1 as our rightmost bit, and then it falls off the cliff, and then we're gonna replace it with another 0 to the left. And that's what we get by shifting this string x by 3 bits to the right. The other concept that we need to be familiar with, which is very similar in nature, is right rotation. This time, instead of replacing it with just 0 to the left, we're gonna replace the fallen bit with the same bit to the left. So not 0. So if this time we have a 1 to the right and we are replacing it, we're not gonna replace it with a 0, but replace it with the same bit. So in that case, if it is 1, then we're gonna replace it with a 1 to the left. So let's see an example. We have this string here again, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. And we want to see what happens if you want to right rotate it by 3 bits. So in the first case, we have a 1 to the right. So we are shifting it. We push to the 1 to the left. We are bringing it to the left, rotating it to the left, hence the name right rotation. And we're going to push the remaining bits in. And this is what we're going to get, as you would have guessed. Now, if you want to right rotate it by 2 bits, now we have a 0 as our rightmost bit. Just bring it to the left again, like a circular rotation, and push all the remaining bits forward, and that's the resulting string. And then same thing again for rotation by 3 bits. Now we have a 1 to the right. Again, we're gonna push it we're going to bring the 1 to the left and push the remaining bits one place forward. Next, we need to be familiar with the conversions between bits, decimals, and hexadecimals. So a number can be represented in different bases. Ordinary numbers that we deal with on a daily basis, for example, currency, maybe height, weight, they are expressed in base 10, and we use digits 0 to 9 to express those numbers. We have binary, which is the preferred method for representing numbers in computers, and it is in base 2, and we use digits only 0 and 1 to represent those numbers. And we have hexadecimals, which is another way of representing a number, but this time in base 16. We use digits 0 to 9 and letters A, B, C, D, E, and F for numbers 10 all the way to 15. So F corresponds to 15 and A corresponds to 10. So next we're gonna see a table of value for the first few integer values that we deal with on a regular basis. So number 0 in binary and hexadecimal is 0, same with 1, nothing special. When we get to number 2, it corresponds to 1, 0 in binary, and again number 2 in hexadecimals. And once we get to number 15, that's the last number that you can represent with only one character in hexadecimals, which is F. So now once we add another value to 15, we get 16. We can see its binary representation, but this time in hexadecimals, it is represented by 10. So actually number 10 in hexadecimals correspond to number 16 in base 10, and so on. So these conversions are important to know when we are dealing with SHA function in order to better understand them. Next concept that we need to be familiar with is the concept of fractions in binary. So in general, we know how to convert integers in base 10 to binary. That's not that difficult. So we're gonna see an example for number 27. Well, we can write 27 as 2 times 13 plus 1. One thing I like to point out here is that we are actually dividing 27 by 2, and we get a quotient of 13 and a remainder of 1. That becomes important later on. So just keep in mind that we're dividing the number by 2 actually, but we're just writing it in a different way. Now in the next step, because 13 is our quotient, again we're going to divide it by 2. The new quotient this time is 6. The remainder is again number 1. Again, we're going to continue this process. Now the quotient is 6 divided by 2, and so on. Same idea. And then eventually at some point, this algorithm has to terminate in this case. And eventually we're going to put the numbers from bottom to top, and that will be the corresponding representation of number 27 in binary. So 27 in base 10 is equal to 11011 in base 2. Now, this is not that problematic. We know how to convert integers in binary. How we can express integers in binary, but the other question that we can think about is that how can we represent fractions in binary? So if we have a number like 0.375, how do we represent that in binary? Well, in the previous example, we saw we kept dividing numbers by 2, but for fractions, we're gonna multiply numbers by 2. Again, I'm not going into too much details. If you would like, you can look them up, but this is just the concepts, the basic concepts we need to know in order to understand the SHA-512 algorithm. So what I mean by multiplying, well, we want to represent number 0.375 in binary, so we multiply it by 2, and we get a number plus either 0 or 1 that will be our new remainder. So in this case, this number is less than 1, so the remainder is just simply going to be 0. So now this time we're going to multiply 0.075 by 2, we get 1.5. So this time we're going to divide this number to 1 plus a half. So our remainder is 1, and then next step we're going to multiply half by 2, and we get 0 plus another 1 again. And this time we're going to, this is the point that we terminate this algorithm, and we're gonna put the bits from top to bottom. So number 0.375 in base 10 corresponds to number 0.011 in base 2. So it is interesting to see that the same way that we can represent integers in a binary, we can also represent fractions in binary as well. Now, the specific example that I chose for this demonstration has been designed in a way that terminates, but in general, not all fractions terminate necessarily when we want to represent them in binary. But again, that will take us further away from the main topic of this video. But my point is that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, but these are the basic things we need to know in order to understand the SHA-512 algorithm. So the observation that we've made so far is that fraction can be expressed in the same way that integers can be in base 10. The methodology that we're going to use is that if we would like the first n bits of a fraction in binary, we multiply it by 2 to the n, and then represent the corresponding number in binary, and we add zeros to the left if necessary to make it n bits. I will just show you an example of what I mean by that. So in the previous example, we had 0.375, and we would like to represent it in binary using 3 bits. So we just multiply this number by 2 to the 3. In this case, we get 3. And then we're going to represent number 3 in binary. Well, 3 in binary is just simply 1, 1. But because we wanted to get the 3 bits binary, we add a 0 to the left if necessary to make it that number of bits that we wanted. So in this case, we have 3 bits. And we can see that it agrees with our previous results. So 0.375 in base 10 is equal to 0.011 in base 2. The next idea that we need to use in SHA-512 algorithm is the first 80 primes. Now, you might wonder, why do we need to use the first 80 primes? In general, for hash functions, it is customary to use an initial vector. And again, for our initial vector, we would like our initial vector to be as random as possible. And it turned out that prime numbers have a good representation of randomness in them. Well, the prime itself on its own is just a number, but when you take square roots, for example, of primes, then you're gonna see random patterns. And based on experience, it's been proven that the randomness in this prime is much more reliable than randomness that humans can generate. So that's why we simply use the randomness that primes generate, and we can use them with confidence. Actually, prime numbers come up in 2 different places in SHA-512 algorithm. The first part is for the initial vector, where we use the 64-bit fractional binary of the square root of the first 8 prime, and then another place that it comes up, for it we need the 64-bit fractional binary of the cubic root of the first 80 primes. So one time we use the first 8 primes, and then the other time we're gonna use the first 80 primes. And now we're gonna see an example of what is meant by that. So the first 64 bits of the fractional part of square root of 2, how can it be computed? Well, the square root of 2 is roughly 1.4142 and other digits that we can see on the screen. Its fractional part is just whatever we get after the decimal point. So in this case, the integer component is 1. So if we just drop the integer component, we get 0.4142 and so on. Now we multiply this number by 2 to the 64. As you remember, this is the methodology that we used for representing fractions in binary. And if we just take the integer component of this multiplication, this is the number that we get in base 10. And similarly, this is its representation in base 2. You can see I added a 0 to the left. This becomes important later on because in SHA-512, we have to operate over words of 64 bits. So if the resulting number is not 64 bit, we're gonna make it 64 bit by adding zeros if necessary. And in hexadecimals, it is represented by the following value. Now with this, we are coming to the end of the first component of our introduction to SHA-512 algorithm. In the next video, we're gonna see the actual algorithm. We're gonna see everything that has been covered in this video will play an important role in the algorithm, and we're gonna see a worked example. So I hope you've enjoyed this video so far, and I know that there has been a lot of information, but bear with me, and I hope by the end of the second part, you have a better understanding of SHA-512. See you there.